May 1944. The island of Brač, off the coast of occupied Yugoslavia. The place is a desolate, rocky furnace. The mission: dislodge an entrenched German garrison. The odds were, to put it mildly, long. The men pinned down around him weren't just fighting Germans. They were fighting the weather. They were fighting a near-suicidal ascent. And they were fighting a man who, by this point in the war, was less a conventional soldier and more a force of nature. His name was John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill. But everyone called him Jack. And on this miserable ridge in the Adriatic, Jack was about to stage the final, most defining act of his astonishing military career. An act that was completely insane. He stands, drawing the massive basket-hilted broadsword from its scabbard. Not a modern combat knife, not a Sten gun, but a medieval piece of steel. A symbol of his commitment to, as he put it, properly waging war. Jack Churchill, during an interview, he said, "I saw no sense in going into battle without my sword. After all, if you didn't have a sword, how was anyone to know you were a gentleman?" It was a massacre. Churchill and his 8 remaining men reached the crest, only to find themselves staring into the barrel of something they hadn't anticipated, a German Panzer tank. The tank was backed by heavy machine gun nests. The commandos were exhausted. They were out of ammunition. They were staring down the most efficient, brutal killing machine of the age. What happened next? Wildest surrender of World War. Is the end of one story and the beginning of a legend. But to understand how a British officer armed with a 14th century sword came to face down a 20th century tank, we have to go back to the beginning. Back to the day Jack Churchill made his first indelible mark on the war. The spring of 1940, the German Blitzkrieg had shattered the French army and pushed the entire British expeditionary force to the sea. The port of Dunkirk was their last hope. A desperate scramble to escape the jaws of annihilation. At the center of this chaos was Captain Jack Churchill, then of the Manchester Regiment. He was already an eccentric. A former world-class archer, he had been known to carry his personal kit in a large leather trunk marked with the motto, "Don't take life too seriously. You'll never get out alive." Rex King Clark said in an interview, Jack was never suited for the modern army. He saw war as a kind of grand, slightly ridiculous sport. He had an aesthetic about it, a conviction that a man should meet his foe with courage and panache, not just firepower. His choice of weapon reflected that it was a rebuke to mechanized, impersonal warfare, and as the British forces desperately awaited rescue, Churchill's commitment to proper panache would lead to a scene that belongs less in a military history and more in a medieval epic. On May 27th, Churchill and a small patrol were tasked with holding a key defensive position near the village of Lipinet. As German infantry began to probe the lines, Churchill prepared for battle. He was armed with his service rifle, his sword, and a 6-foot-long English longbow he'd brought with him from the UK. The longbow hadn't been a standard British weapon since the 17th century. Yet here is Churchill in the face of the Wehrmacht with one. It speaks volumes about the man's psychology. He wasn't just fighting the Germans. He was fighting to maintain his own romantic vision of warfare, the units. War Diary, a primary source, shows the action was brief and brutal. As the German patrol advanced, Churchill waited until one of them came into the ideal kill zone. One of the most astonishing claims of the Second World War is that Jack Churchill killed a German soldier with a longbow during the retreat to Dunkirk. The question is it true? This is where we go to the primary evidence. We can't find a direct record in the British War Diaries that specifically names the weapon used to kill a German soldier on that day. However, we have multiple accounts, including the post-war IDM oral history from Churchill himself, claiming the kill. And crucially, we have the contemporary press reports. His 1996 obituary in the Daily Telegraph mentions the event as a matter of fact. The weight of anecdotal evidence from his peers and Churchill's own unwavering claim strongly suggests that this anachronistic, impossible kill actually happened. Jack Churchill, Intercable said in a triumphant tone, "I must confess I was terribly pleased. It was a good shot. Pity about the man, but I was pleased with the arrow. I felt a great sense of satisfaction that the longbow had at last struck a blow for the good side. With that single, improbable shot, Churchill had carved his name into the annals of the war. But the day was not over. The British withdrawal was under heavy German pressure, and the morale of the exhausted troops was failing. His next move was a stunning piece of audacious theatre. To stop the rout and rally the men, Jack Churchill performed his duty in the only way he knew how, by staging a spectacle. Churchill didn't just play the pipes. He charged, sword drawn, bagpipes wailing, directly into a German-held position, the sound of the pipes, an instrument of war long abandoned by most of the modern army, cut through the sounds of shell fire. It was a jarring sound, a rallying cry, a challenge. The Germans stopped firing. For a moment, they simply did not know what they were hearing. It was so unexpected, so utterly illogical, that it gave the British troops the pause they desperately needed. He played them off the battlefield. He played them back to the fight. For this action, rallying the troops under fire and holding the line until the last possible moment, Captain Churchill was awarded the Military Cross MC. The official citation, printed in the London Gazette, details the initiative and complete disregard for personal danger that saved his men. It was the first of many such citations. Dunkirk was a defeat. But for Jack Churchill, it was a profound personal victory. He had fought the war his way, with steel, with music, and with a deeply felt, almost absurd sense of adventure. He was one of the last men off the beaches. But he had no intention of resting. The war, to Jack Churchill, had just become interesting. The mechanized horrors of modern war demanded a man who would fight it with a longbow, a sword, and a tune. The commandos were being formed, and they needed a man exactly like Mad Jack. The commandos were an elite unit designed for shock raids, operating behind enemy lines. They were exactly the place for a man with unlimited boldness, to quote his friend and biographer, Rex King Clark. Churchill found his natural home with No. 2 Commando, and there his legend would be set in stone on the frozen shores of Norway, where his sword would taste German blood for the first time. The Dunkirk evacuation made one thing clear. Britain needed to hit back, not with massive armies, but with precision. The answer was the commandos. Small, highly trained elite units, designed to execute devastating raids against the German-held coastline of Europe. They needed the toughest, most unorthodox men available. And that is exactly where Captain Jack Churchill belonged. In 1941, Churchill was officially transferred to No. 2 Commando. His reputation, the longbow, the bagpipes, preceded him. His contemporaries considered him both a lunatic and an inspiration. He was unique, but his methods were devastatingly effective for raising morale and creating chaos. The commandos were, by definition, an eccentric unit. But even among them, Jack was an anomaly. His philosophy was simple: surprise and spectacle. Read Confusion. You fight not just to win, but to terrify. The sheer improbability of seeing a man charge you with a basket-hilted broadsword was a weapon in itself. The first major offensive action of the new commandos was Operation Archery. The target, the small but strategically vital islands of Vigsy and Maclay off the Norwegian coast. The mission was to destroy the German fish oil production and naval presence. December 27, 1941. The coast of Norway is a freezing, windswept maze of fjords and inlets. The weather was atrocious. Visibility was poor. Conditions that were perfect for a lightning strike. As the commandos approached the village of Maclay, they came under heavy fire from German positions. The first wave of troops, led by Churchill's men, landed directly onto the wharf. This was a classic, brutal house-to-house fight. The kind of close-quarters combat where a modern rifle can jam and the bayonet is often too slow. As Churchill leaped from his landing craft, he was not armed with a rifle. He was not even carrying a pistol. Instead, he unslung his bagpipes and began to play a wild, roaring tune, March of the Inter-Allied Services. The music was instantly recognizable to the British troops. To the Germans, it was just terrifying. Noise, a bizarre prelude to battle. Then, he made his move. Asterisk, this is the moment the legend solidifies. The unit diary for Operation Archery is critical here. It confirms the action. Churchill wasn't just rallying troops. He was leading a direct close-quarters assault on a concrete pillbox position. Captain Churchill, sword drawn high above his head, charged across the open ground toward a German machine gun nest. This was not a symbolic gesture. This was a proper medieval-style assault. He was the first and, so far as records show, the only British soldier to kill a German enemy combatant with a broadsword in the Second World War. The speed of the charge, the surprise of the weapon, and the shock of the bagpipes simultaneously playing broke the German defense. Churchill and his men secured the position, taking several prisoners. The sight of this immense yelling man, charging across the snow with a shining piece of historical steel, was simply overwhelming. Asterisk, when you are attacking in a built-up area, and all the shooting is going on, the thing to do is keep the enemy off balance. My sword was very good for that. It's hard to shoot straight when a maniac is running at you, waving an 18-pound sword and shouting. Churchill was wounded by shrapnel during the raid, but refused treatment until the objectives were secured. Operation Archery was a resounding success. The commandos destroyed millions of pounds worth of strategic material, and for a short time, they demonstrated that Britain could land and strike anywhere. For his actions at WWII, for the audacious leadership and the successful, if utterly insane, use of his anachronistic arsenal, Major Churchill was awarded the Distinguished Service Order, DSO. Once again, the official citation in the London Gazette is the primary record. It praises his gallant and distinguished services in the field. The citation doesn't mention the sword or the bagpipes, but his colleagues knew exactly what had earned him the honor. The WWII raid was over and Churchill had proved his point. The ancient methods of combat had a place in modern war, especially in the hands of a man utterly without fear. The only question now was where he would take his sword and his pipes next. As the war moved from the freezing fjords of Norway to the burning sands of the Mediterranean, Major Churchill was about to stage his masterpiece. By 1943, Major Jack Churchill and No. 2 Commando were veterans. They were no longer raiding. They were leading major invasions. Their new target, Salerno, Italy, Operation Avalanche. This was the Allied attempt to seize a foothold on the mainland and knock Italy out of the war. The landing at Salerno was brutal. The German defense was fierce and well organized. The commandos were tasked with seizing a strategic enemy observation post that was raining shellfire down on the beaches. The position was a fortified German gun battery situated high on a ridge, overlooking the entire Salerno Bay. To approach, it meant scaling a steep, heavily wooded slope under constant bombardment. Churchill and a handful of commandos began their silent ascent in the dark hours before dawn. Asterisk, this action, perhaps more than any other, defines the blend of audacity and tactical genius that Churchill possessed. He wasn't reckless. He was meticulous in his madness. He knew the chaos of the environment was his greatest weapon. As the small force neared the summit, Churchill's final preparations were, as always, utterly unique. He loaded his bagpipes and began to play. Rex King Clark interview. The Germans, asleep in their dugouts, must have woken up thinking they were hallucinating. Imagine hearing the skirling of the pipes echoing off the Italian hills, followed immediately by a madman with a sword bursting through the door. Churchill once again, drawing his basket-hilted broadsword, launched the attack at first light. The charge was swift, decisive, and terrifying. The commando unit quickly neutralized the outer defenses and seized the observation post. Churchill then pressed ahead, sword leading the way. He found the path leading down from the gun position, and that is where he encountered the main body of the German defenders. In a small sunken ravine, there was a group of German infantry taking cover. Churchill found himself alone, looking down upon them. What happened next is the most famous and best documented of Churchill's solo exploits. He drew his pistol and emptied the magazine into the air. He then dropped the pistol, pulled out a captured German stick grenade, and hurled it into the middle of the enemy group. He then bellowed his favorite commando war cry, which his men had heard many times before. Commando! The German soldiers, shocked by the grenade, the noise, and the sight of a massive man brandishing a sword, assumed they were surrounded by a much larger force. They surrendered immediately. The count, 42 German soldiers and a mortar crew. When the rest of his commando patrol caught up, they found Major Churchill standing guard over his prisoners. His sword was sheathed, his demeanor calm, and he was smoking a cigarette. Jack said, "I had my sword, and I had my charm." They were, shall we say, sufficiently impressed by the display. I was rather disappointed that the fighting was over so quickly. The successful capture of the observation post and the taking of 42 prisoners, a primary claim thoroughly cross-referenced with the 4th Infantry Brigade Unit War Diaries, was a major factor in securing the Salerno beachhead. It saved countless Allied lives. Churchill, for this incredible feat of single-handed leadership, was awarded a bar to his Distinguished Service Order, the highest decoration for repeated bravery in command. The war records confirm the details, the timing, the location, and the result. No embellishment was needed. Major Jack Churchill had led a charge with a sword and taken 42 prisoners, but Jack Churchill was not finished with the war, and he certainly wasn't finished with his sword. The next phase would take him to the rugged Balkans, where his luck and his sword would finally run out. The war was turning, but the fighting in the Balkans was savage. Churchill was now a lieutenant colonel, leading a composite force of commandos and Yugoslav partisans on a series of raids against German garrisons across the Adriatic islands. His operations were designed to tie down German troops and provide aid to the local resistance. The missions were highly dangerous. The British and the Germans fought a war of attrition in the rocky, unforgiving terrain. This brings us back to the place where our story began, the island of Brac. In May 1944, the target was the town of Nereziska, a strongly held German position on a ridge. Churchill was ordered to attack with limited forces, relying on speed and total commitment. The first assault failed, shattered by concentrated German mortar and machine gun fire. Churchill's force was decimated, reduced to a handful of men. He was ordered to withdraw, but Churchill had a deep commitment to his objectives. He was also fiercely loyal to the partisans he fought alongside. Withdrawal to him was an option only after every ounce of possibility had been exhausted. He chose to charge again. At Brac, Churchill was no longer operating with the element of surprise. The Germans knew where he was and how thin his line was. The final charge was not tactical. It was an act of pure, magnificent defiance. It was less about military success and more about showing the enemy that they would not stop fighting. No matter the odds. In the dead of night, May 27, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel Churchill gathered his few remaining men, 8 commandos and 1 partisan sergeant, for the final ascent of the ridge. He did not load his rifle. He loaded his bagpipes. As they began the final advance, Churchill stood up and began to play a slow, mournful lament. The tune was, "Will They No Come Back Again?" An ironic and defiant serenade to a battle he knew was lost. The moment he stopped playing, the German defenses opened up. The ground around the men erupted. It was in this final, climactic chaos that Churchill ran headlong into the symbol of everything he fought against, the modern mechanized Panzer tank. The tank was supported by multiple machine gun nests. The commandos were pinned down, out of ammunition. Their commander, however, was not. Churchill stood up. His sword was drawn. He was alone. He knew it was over. But Jack Churchill would not be cornered. He would not hide. He went out the way. He came in, with a salute to the history of warfare. Sword in hand, the tank fired a high explosive shell, hitting just feet from Churchill. The concussion sent rocks and shrapnel flying. Churchill was knocked unconscious. When he woke up, he was surrounded. The German soldiers were staring, not at his uniform, but at the enormous sword lying next to him. The wildest surrender of the war was complete. The commandos were captured, but the Germans were more baffled than victorious. One German officer reportedly asked him why he fought with a sword. "If it hadn't been for that damn tank, I would have got away with it." Churchill was immediately separated from his men. He was too important, too infamous, and too baffling to be treated as a regular prisoner. He was flown directly from the field of battle to Berlin for interrogation. The war for Jack Churchill had just shifted from the battlefield to the prison camp. He would now fight his final enemy, captivity. Next, Churchill's incredible escape from Sachsenhausen and the long walk across the Alps to freedom, from the rugged slopes of Brac. Lieutenant Colonel Jack Churchill was transported across Europe to Berlin for initial interrogation. The Germans, utterly confused by their eccentric, sword-carrying prisoner, were unsure how to categorize him. He was a commando leader, an expert archer, a piper, and a man who fought with relics. He was soon transferred to one of the most notorious German high-security prisons for VIP prisoners, Sachsenhausen concentration camp, north of Berlin. Sachsenhausen was built for permanent, punitive detention. Yet, even behind the walls of a Nazi prison, Churchill's spirit remained unbowed. He immediately began planning his escape. They put me in a place that looked quite secure, but I said to myself, if you lose your sense of humor, you've lost the war. So I decided I'd simply walk out. Churchill's first attempt was in September 1944. He had been planning for weeks, scouting the perimeter, memorizing the guard rotations. He and a fellow officer, Captain Barry, crawled through a concealed drainage pipe, emerging just outside the camp perimeter wire. They began the long, perilous journey south, aiming for the Baltic coast. The escape lasted only 3 days. They were recaptured near the city of Rostock. Churchill later claimed that the main difficulty was trying to find food and trying to keep Captain Barry quiet. The Germans, realizing that Sachsenhausen was not secure enough for this particular prisoner, transferred Churchill to a remote fortified prison camp in Austria, Schloss Eder in South Tyrol. This was an extraordinary move, housing VIP prisoners who the Nazis wanted to keep alive as potential bargaining chips. Schloss Eder was a castle, high in the Alps, guarded by SS troops, supposedly escape-proof. But the war was drawing to a close and chaos was setting in. The transfer to Eder was a stroke of luck or perhaps fate. The remoteness of the prison also meant the guards became detached from the central command structure. When Hitler died and the SS began to panic, the prison dissolved into anarchy. In late April 1945, the SS guards abandoned the castle, fearing capture by Allied forces. Their parting instruction: kill the prisoners if the Allies approached. Seeing his chance, Churchill scaled the castle walls again, using a method more fitting for a medieval siege than a modern prison break, and set off on foot. I simply walked out the back gate and started moving. I had a rough idea of which way the American lines were, and I was in excellent walking condition from my days in the Sudan. I made better time than the Germans did retreating. Churchill's second successful escape involved walking nearly 150 miles across the snow-capped Austrian Alps, alone, carrying no food, relying on his formidable outdoor skills. After days of walking and climbing, he encountered an advancing column of American forces near the Brenner Pass. He was free. His escape marked the end of his personal war against the Germans. But Jack Churchill was, characteristically, disappointed. He was furious that the war in Europe was about to end. When the American unit asked him where he was going, he told them he was trying to find some heavy fighting. The war was ending, and he complained bitterly, saying, "If it wasn't for those damned Yankees, we could have kept the war going for another 10 years. He returned to England, deeply dissatisfied with the premature arrival of peace. He immediately volunteered for the fighting against Japan. The war against Japan ended while Churchill was still en route. Crossing the Indian Ocean, he was left with a single, regretful statement that encapsulates the entire man. If it hadn't been for the Americans dropping that bomb, we could have had another jolly good crack at them. Lieutenant Colonel Jack Churchill, the last man to make a confirmed kill with a longbow, the only man to lead a sword charge in World War II, finally accepted peace. He retired from the army, but not from adventure. He went on to become an avid surfer in Australia, using his war experience to invent new methods of wave riding. He remained a man perpetually out of time, living by his own personal code of chivalry and adventure, until his death in 1996. Conclusion. Final thoughts. Jack Churchill was an eccentric, a maniac, and a legend. His story, verified by war diaries and award citations, proves that even in the face of mechanized industrial slaughter, the spirit of individual courage and pure, magnificent audacity can still win the day. His broadsword and his bagpipes were not just weapons. They were symbols of a refusal to be defined by his enemy. He proved that sometimes the wildest way is the best way. He truly was Mad Jack, and he lived by the only motto that mattered: any officer who goes into action without his sword is improperly dressed.